We'd like to convene the Budget, Finance, and Business Operations Committee. If we could see if any of our other committee members may be in the breakfast room. That would be great so we can get started and stay on track for the rest of the day. Mikey, would you give us a roll, please?
Sure. Madam Vice Chair, are you on the line?
I'm here, Mikey.
Excellent. Mr. Edwards?
Present.
Ms. Roberts?
Here.
Commissioner Smith? Mr. Temple is not here. Mr. Tripp?
Here.
You have a quorum.
Thank you, Mikey. Let me just call to order and begin with a bit of a summary of our last legislative session. We had, as you know, a very difficult session, as did the entire state of Florida, and the legislature had to make some very tough decisions. Fortunately, our president got together towards the end of the session, held a press conference, and made some requests of the legislature, which the legislature saw fit to grant. And the legislature responded well to provide more opportunity for higher education and create some flexibility in our system. And for that, we are grateful. We'll be hearing a little bit from our presidents this afternoon in the board meeting on what they're doing to plan for the future, to shield the blow of this cuts this session or any changes which may be coming down the line, but that will happen during the board meeting. But on the whole, the legislature responded well to higher education. We're grateful for the fund allocations, for the additional stimulus dollars, and for the flexibility they've given us through the differential tuition program so that we can begin to make certain that we retain quality here in our state university system. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and move into agenda item 1, which is the tuition differential.
Second.
Well, check.
Do you want a second?
Not just yet, thank you.
I'm ready.
This committee met on a telephone conference a week and a half ago and considered the tuition differential requests from each of the 11 state universities. Each of the universities at this time has chosen through its board of trustees to exercise its option for a full increase of a total of combined from state and the differential tuition of 15%. We reviewed those differential plans, we reviewed their methodology and their metrics, and approved in 2 separate tranches to recommend to the full board this afternoon approval of the differential tuition increases from all 11 state universities. One tranche of those which had approved the differential tuition through the board of trustees prior to our meeting, and the other group was one who was going to have approved it prior to our meeting today, but who had sent it through its committee processes. I can report to the committee that all 11 university board of trustees have approved the differential tuition program, and we'll be recommending approval of all 11 this afternoon. Any questions there? Seeing none, great. There were some issues raised in the conference call with regard to monitoring and metrics going forward. We've got a report to the legislature in January, as well as how we're going to account for the 30% of need-based financial aid to be pulled from that process. And I'm going to reserve that conversation for the end of the meeting today once we get through our traditional agenda, because we do need to talk about it a little bit and set a plan going forward. So if you'll bear with me, we'll do that at the end of the agenda. Next agenda item is the 2009-2010 appropriations. I'm going to ask Tim to just give us a brief final overview of the appropriations for 09 and 10. Tim?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Can everybody hear me? Here's a pie chart of the state budget for 2019, $66.5 billion. This includes about $5.7 billion in federal stimulus funds. So without those funds, we'd have a state budget of roughly $60 billion, which is down from $71 billion 2 years ago. And most of that decrease is, of course, related to general revenue. If we just take a look at the general revenue lottery portion of the budget, or the operating section as we refer to it, you have a budget of about $22 billion, with education getting a little over $12 billion, which is 56% of the budget. The total budget for education is down about $4 billion from 2 years ago. Just take a look at the education slice of the pie. You can see the university system. Can't hear?
I couldn't hear you.
Sorry. If you take a look at the university piece of that pie, we get about 16%. And that percentage has stayed the same even though our total dollars have declined. As the chair said, our budget for 9/10 is approximately the same as it was for 8/9, thanks to the federal stimulus funds. You can see general revenue was down for the system about $212 million. But then we have federal stimulus funding of about $159 million, so we ended up close to the 08-09 appropriation. In your packet on page 7, there's a detailed breakout by the university. It's an 11 by 17 sheet of paper with the universities going across the top. Down on the left-hand side are the individual issues that the legislature can consider during session. So if you look at row 7 is the beginning point for the legislature, which was the 08-09 recurring base budget. And starting with rows 10 through 34 are the individual issues that the legislature considered in developing their 9/10 budget. And then you have the grand total on row 35. And below that shaded line is the allocation by revenue source as shown in the General Appropriations Act. So the detail you see above that shaded line doesn't show up in the GAA, only in legislative work papers. So I thought the committee may be interested in seeing the detail on how the legislature came up with their final numbers. Now this slide here shows appropriations by fund for the last 4 years. So you can see what has happened with the general revenue and lottery. Over that time, we've had about a 20% decrease in state appropriations. Tuition has gradually increased, and then we had the federal stimulus funds of about $159 billion that have kept our total funding at about 08-09 levels. If you look at our appropriations per FTE student, the red line represents tuition. You see a gradual increase over the last 10 years. The blue line there in the middle is state and lottery appropriations. You can see how that has fluctuated greatly with a high of a little over $8,000 a student 4 years ago, down to about $7,000 a student now. That $7,000 does include the federal stimulus funding, which is about $550 a student. So without those dollars, our state appropriations per FTE would be about $6,500. Take a quick look at the PICO appropriations, and there is detail on page 4 of your packet. As you can see, just a little over $100 million in PICO, which is the lowest we've had in definitely the last 4 years, and going back, Chris, it's maybe been 15, 20 years since we've had those kinds of levels of appropriations. And they did fully fund the board's request. Take just a second look at the Board of General Office budget. Over the last 4 years, you can see we've gone from a $7 million budget to $5.6 million. You see, I just want to point out the general revenue line for the board office dropped about $2 million over this year. We were fortunate to get some federal stimulus funds to offset that. So we'll have to work with the universities over the next couple of years to come up with recurring sources to replace those dollars. We were thankful that the governor vetoed the 2% salary reduction from state employees. That was a good part. The bad part was those funds had already been cut for our budget. So to make up that 2%, we have to use our existing resources to do that. So we're still feeling a cut from the 2%. We just have to come up with the dollars from another source to pay for them. You'll see the number of positions in the office have not changed. We're still at 53 positions, which is a good thing. We do have 5 vacant positions. Of course, one of those is the chancellor. We are saving a few dollars for him or her if we get a new chancellor. The other 4 positions we're going to have to keep vacant because If you look on page 8 of your packet, which is our board office detail, we received a cut in our salary budget of about $300,000. So even though we have the positions available, we do not have the dollars to pay salaries for those other vacant positions. And that's kind of a quick overview of the appropriations bill that the governor signed just a couple of weeks ago.
Great, Tim, thanks. Any questions for Tim with regard to legislative session?
Yes, Mr. Chairman.
Yes, Governor Evers.
Tim, I don't expect you to know these numbers off the top of your head, but I think it would be interesting to go back pre-lottery, say 1980, and for like 1980, 1990, 2000, and 2009, give us a percentage of the general revenue spent on education, leaving the lottery out. In other words, in 1980, what was the percentage of general revenue the state devoted to education, and then follow it like every 10 years. I have not seen those numbers in a number of years, but I really think that will give you a good snapshot at what has happened to the state budget and to education in the state.
Sure, I would be glad to do that for you.
Other questions or comments for Tim with regard to the budget? Okay, seeing none, we'll move to agenda item 3, the American Recovery and Investment Act. As we know, as Tim just pointed out, we're sitting about $160 million in federal stimulus funds for 2009 and 10. That's basically what kept us, almost held us harmless as a system this legislative cycle. However, we also know that those stimulus funds are non-recurring and are going to have to be replaced at some point, somehow, some way, or additional cuts are going to be made. We're going to start addressing what we're going to do there and plan for there in the August meeting of the board when we discuss the 10-11 LBR. I've gotten a lot of questions from people just asking, how much is it statewide, education-wide, where's the money coming from, where's it going to, who's deciding where it goes? And I thought it'd be good for Tim to give us a brief presentation on the American Recovery and Investment Act of 2009 and how it plays into our state's educational system. Tim?
Thank you, sir. I'm going to focus initially just on the state fiscal stabilization funds, which are the dollars that came through the legislature to our state universities. It ended up at about $160 million, as Governor Perez said. But nationally, there were two pots for the state fiscal stabilization fund. There was an education pot of about $39.7 billion, which went towards K-20 public school education. Then there was an $8.8 billion pot of discretionary, or what we're calling general operations funding. This could go to governors and legislatures to be used for any purpose. It could be public service, health, environment, education. It's totally at their discretion to be used for government operations. So out of each of those two pots of money, Florida was eligible for $2.2 billion in education funding and almost half, and $491 million in discretionary funding. And that would be over a 2-year period. So if you take what we were eligible for and look at the 9-10 appropriation, the legislature appropriated half of the funds in each funding category in the 9-10 GAA. So $1.1 billion for K-20 education, $246 million for discretionary. And all of that discretionary funding was put in education, so we're very thankful that the governor and the legislature did that, because it could have went to other sectors of the state, but they realized the importance of education and put it in that pot. So if you just look at the $1.1 billion for K-20 education, you can see K-12 got about 80% of that, in college is 8%, and then the SUS about 13%, or $140 million of the education funding. And on page 11 of your packet, there's detail by institution and how much everybody received from the education funds as well as the discretionary funds. you look at the discretionary appropriation of $246 million, and here is how it was allocated by sector, with K-12 getting about 56%. The SUS received almost $21 million of the discretionary funds. The state board got a little money, and there's the Board of Governors got $1.5 billion. Most, or a big chunk of the discretionary funds went to private colleges, some to the state board and some to us because we weren't eligible for the other K-20 education funding. So what are some of the uses of the state fiscal stabilization fund? Pursuant to section 14004 of the federal legislation, it can be used for E&G expenditures. So that leaves it pretty wide open in terms of their intended uses. So it would be for salaries, libraries, labs, financial aid, etc. It is also supposed to help mitigate tuition and fee increases for in-state students and to modernize or repair facilities. The very last item we have to be careful with as a system, because the legislature has to provide an appropriation for fixed capital outlay projects exceeding $1 million. They did not do that. So universities will have to be careful, making sure that if they do modernization or repairs, keep it less than the $1 million threshold, since there is not a state appropriation for those. You need to remember that the primary focus of federal legislation was to save and create jobs. Over the last month, we've been working with K-12, community colleges, and us to develop a series of forms and applications which we have provided to the universities for them to submit and return to us. And those forms were due in our office this past Monday. They have indicated that with the federal stimulus funds, they are able to save or continue almost 2,700 positions within the state university system. So that was the criticality of these funds, to be able to save those jobs going forward, at least for the next year. So what are some of the prohibited uses of the fund? Can't use it to increase endowments, nor to maintain systems or equipment. No funding can be spent on stadiums, nothing related to religious facilities or worship, no new construction. You can't make the money for a rainy day, because it is raining now, so they need to spend those funds as soon as possible. The governor did have the authority through the federal legislation to provide more restrictions on the discretionary funds or the other education funds, but he chose not to do that. So we're really just following what the federal guidelines are in terms of prohibited uses. But we've really been working with our universities because there is going to be a very critical accounting of these dollars through the GAO office. They have been down to visit USF, they visited FAMU, they've also been talking to our office on how we're going to be spending those dollars, how we're going to be accountable for those dollars. So we're going to have some detailed tracking mechanisms of all of these expenditures. Because we are one of 16 states that was singled out as receiving special attention on the uses of these funds. On page 13 to 21 of your packet are various forms that we've worked on with our partners in K-12 and community colleges that our universities have seen. They've all completed these forms and submitted them to our office this past week. Details, they're telling us what they're going to use those dollars for, assurances that they're going to spend them on what's allowed in the federal legislation. And it was a good thing we developed all these forms, because that was one of the things that the GAO has been asking us as a recipient of these funds, is how are we making the universities and other education entities accountable for the dollars. I want to talk briefly just about the other stimulus funds that are available. We know billions of dollars went to federal agencies such as NIH or NSF or the Department of Energy. On page 12 of your packet, just a brief summary of the number of applications our universities have submitted to federal agencies to try and receive some of those stimulus dollars. So over 700 applications have been submitted. requesting over $400 million of those federal funds. So we'll be getting updates from these on a regular basis. This information will eventually put on the governor's website to show what kind of money will be coming into Florida from other areas. Just to kind of give you an idea of how competitive this is nationally, NIH received over $10 billion in stimulus grants to provide. Over 21,000 applications have been submitted nationally for that $10 billion. Out of the 700 applications that Florida universities have submitted, 600 of those have gone to NIH. So you just look at the volume that NIH is getting, it's going to take months literally to get through all those applications to make awards. So a lot of these awards won't be coming until probably later this fall. And that's all I have regarding stimulus money.
Great. Questions for Tim? Governor Duncan.
Tim, I heard one rumor that the legislature might be looking at, on the second year of funds, requesting to split it over 2 years, the remaining 2, so we don't have such a steep cliff. Have you heard much on that, and are we engaged in any of that dialogue?
I have not heard that. The federal legislation requires the funds to be spent by the end of June 30th, 2011.
Right, yeah, the point was they may request a variance to that.
Well, they can always ask, they'd have to change the federal legislation because it is pretty specific, but I have not heard that rumor.
Okay. If we have a position on that one way or the other, we may want to.
No, I mean, as of right now, we're planning on spending everything through June 30, 2011. There's still time for that to change over the next few months.
Other questions for Tim on the stimulus funds? Okay, seeing none. Tim, you know, it's interesting. Every couple of weeks, I'll call up to the board office and say, hey, Tim, it'd be cool if we had a presentation on this. And he says, okay. And we get these in-depth things. And I just want you to know I appreciate that. Tim, it's very enlightening. And I want you to go ahead now and enlighten us, or depress us, as the case may be, with the 10-11 revenue outlook.
Oh, boy. Really talking about that.
I always call him my little ray of sunshine, this guy.
And since we will be doing the OBR in just a couple of months, we probably may want to take a look at where we're going to be in terms of revenue forecast. And remember, the revenue projections that we're looking at came out back in February and March. So things have changed since then, and they will probably change before the next revenue estimating conferences. There is a little bit of good news. If you look at the general revenue estimates over the last 2 years, 0 represents the estimate. The revenues that come in were below the estimate for 24 straight months. Finally, in April of this year, the revenues exceeded the estimate by about $66 million. The main numbers are not out yet, but preliminarily we have heard that they will exceed the estimate also. So it's a little bit of good news. Maybe there's a little bit of confidence in consumer spending, or maybe we just got the estimates low enough to finally meet the federal revenue. But anyway, if that trend would continue, at least there's a good optimism that we would not receive any mid-year cuts, because we'd be right on target with our revenue projections. And these are the March revenue estimates as provided by the Office of Economic and Demographic Research. And you see for 2009-10, the old forecast was $22 billion. The March forecast was almost $20 billion. For 10-11, they're estimating $21 billion in revenue, just $1 billion more than 9-10. Generally, state expenditures are $2 to $3 billion, increasing every year. So there's not going to be enough new revenue to offset increasing expenditures. We have $5.7 billion in our stimulus funding in the appropriations bill for next year. There's not going to be enough money to start buying down some of those federal dollars. So it's going to be another difficult year if the revenue projections hold as they are. So you have really no growth in GR. Lottery, which is, there's some detail on page 26 of your packet, will basically be flat. We have heard that the lottery collections right now are under the estimate by about $80 million, which is is not good, so that would be, allocated between K-20s, or receive a little bit less in lottery appropriations, unless folks start buying more lottery tickets, that'd be a good thing. PICO, on page 27 of your packet, is estimated to be flat. Recall, we got about $120 million this year, so it's going to be another tough year for PICO. I know folks are probably interested in what's happened with the Indian gaming revenue. The legislature did pass a bill this session, asked the governor and the Seminole tribe to get back together to make sure they could agree with the compact. Probably seen some press clippings where the Seminole tribe hasn't totally endorsed that legislation, so they're working with the governor. There may be a special session later this fall to deal with that. But if you just take the legislation that is adopted by the legislature, it would generate about $150 million annually, and that would all go into education. So we're hopeful that will get resolved soon, and if it goes into education for 9-10, that $150 million will help offset that $80 million decrease that we're expecting in the lottery fund. So that's something we can hopefully look forward to later next fiscal year. And also want to remember that next year is election year, so the appetite for new revenues, tax increases, maybe slim to none. So it's going to be another difficult session for us. And that's all I have, Mr. Chairman.
Great, thank you, Tim. Any questions with regard to the 10-11 revenue outlook? Yeah, I feel that way too. Thanks very much, Tim. Item 5 on the agenda are 2 Board of Governors regulations in our process to ongoing update and convert our regulations. There's one for the notice of intent to amend Regulation 9.011, University DSOs and Health Service Support Organizations, and B is notice of intent to repeal Regulation 9.020, University Health Service Support Organizations. Is there a need for presentation? I know we were all briefed on these. Or is there a motion to adopt A and subsequently a motion for B? There's a motion to approve the notice of intent to amend Regulation 9.011 by Governor Edwards. Is there a second? Second. Yeah, it's a second. Is there any discussion or questions? Seeing none, all in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
And opposed. Motion carries. Is there a motion with regard to B? Notice of intent to repeal. Governor Edwards, is there a motion? Okay, there is a motion and a second on item 5B, notice of intent to repeal Regulation 9.020. Is there any discussion? Seeing none, all in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
And opposed. Thank you, motion carries. We're going to move into agenda item number 6, an update on shared services. I want to ask Bill Mark, the Vice President of Administration and Finance here at UCF, to give us an update on the 3 shared service initiatives we have going across the state. Morning, Bill.
Okay, good morning. Thank you. Last August, Chairman Divitt asked our Chairman, Rick Walsh, and Governor Duncan, the Chair of the Committee, looking at best practices across the university system to see what practices could be shared and how we could improve our operations. And that group completed their work, came up with a pretty sizable list with input from all the schools. Following that and trying to come up with some way of implementing some of those best practices, the group was narrowed down with a focus that would engage 3 universities, UCF, FAU, and FIU, to select some of those and try to move them forward, and then share the results with all the other universities so that they could adopt some of the things that we came up with. And we focused, just to give you a quick background, we talked about, well, trying to get all of the 11 universities involved in the project, and we realized that's almost impossible to do with people's schedules and all that sort of thing. So we thought if we focused just with 3 on 3 topics, we could accomplish something and keep things moving in a fairly reasonable way, and I think that's worked. So the 3 of us worked on 3 projects. One of them was looking at builder's risk, the insurance that we all pay when we're building buildings, to see if we could reduce costs there. We looked at a lot of our contracts for supplies and materials, particularly in our auxiliary areas, to see if there's ways we could consolidate and do some better things there. And finally, we looked at our energy management That's a big issue for all of us with growing electrical costs, how we can bring our energy costs down. The first one I want to talk about is the builder's risk management program that we looked at. What we did was we assigned each of the universities one topic that we felt like they had some expertise in to meet the effort of the contributions of the other two. FAU took on looking at builder's risk, and they were already in the process of trying to determine how we could get a master builder's risk program that all of the universities that they could use first. When this project got started, then we started broadening that to say, let's broaden our ITN to look at how we could incorporate all the universities. That was progressing pretty well. We had the input from the other schools, and finally, FAU has completed that project. They've engaged, and there's some detail in your packets about who was engaged and so forth, but we engaged a provider for a master builder's risk program that FAU is estimating, based on what they've seen so far, could save about 15 to 20% on the premiums that the universities are paying for builder's risk. For those of you that haven't been involved that much in the builder's risk type programs, what it is really is insurance on construction projects as they're going up against fire, hurricanes, other kinds of damages that can occur during the project. And typically, the builder, the contractor, procures that insurance and passes on the premium cost to the universities as a part of the construction cost. Everything's insured, and we just bear that cost. And the costs will vary. To give you an order of magnitude, on this campus, for example, some of our recent projects have ranged, and it depends on the size of the project, anywhere from $80,000 or $90,000 for that premium to pushing $350,000 for the premium. And you can imagine across the whole system, with all the projects that are going on, that represents a sizable amount. So this program that was set up, and Ken Jessel, I was talking to him, the Vice President of FAU yesterday, he's planning on sending up the information out to all the universities this next week. It's a voluntary program, it's not mandatory, but the Master Builder's Risk Program will allow the universities to take a look at what the premiums would be charged for their particular product, kind of a percentage-based thing. If they want to ask the contractor to see if they can beat that price, that's acceptable. So they're not bound to it. But it gives an opportunity, really in my mind, it offers two things. One, it offers you a master program that you can probably already get 15 to 20% savings on. But it gives you a tool, too, to go to the contractor and say, if you can beat this, great. We can look at an alternative to it. At any rate, it's a good program. I appreciate all the work that FAU put into it to make it available to the rest of us. And I think it's going to result in some savings that can be put into bricks and mortar rather than just an insurance premium. There's a lot more to it, and I could answer some questions on it if you like, but I'd like to go on for now and just go to the next item. The next item is we're talking about in our auxiliaries how many contracts that we're involved in for office supplies, you name it. There's all sorts of contracts out there that copiers and so forth. A lot of money spent every year on those projects. So FIU has taken the lead in that one and pulled the group together, and that's resulted in a really interesting dialogue between the three universities that has been pretty far-ranging. We had one recently on this campus that I attended where we had one of the bookstores in to talk about some programs there. But what they found, one of the problems that we ran into in trying to share things right away is a lot of us have contracts that are multi-year, like a 3-year, 4-year, 5-year contract for office supplies or copiers and things like that. And so it's hard to have a common contract among us. So what these three schools have agreed to do, they looked at several contracts they think are important to us, like office supplies, for example. And they looked at the expiration dates on the current contracts, and they're working to have all three universities' contracts, either by extension or shortening them, expire at the same time in a couple of years. So that when they expire concurrently, we'll have an opportunity to go out as a group to procure these services and move forward with them. I think that's going to result in some savings. In fact, just the fact that we're talking to each other has saved tens of thousands of dollars for us when we were renegotiating copier contracts, because the copier folks knew or learned that we were all talking to each other, comparing the prices and what kind of deals were given and so forth. And so what we had originally hearing for prices came down during the process, largely because just of the communication. communication. So you can imagine what's going to happen when we go out as a group. When we get a little closer to that, well, not closer to it, but as this thing unfolds, we're going to get through half of the other universities involved to see how many would be willing to join in on some of these contracts. So I think there's a lot of opportunity there that we're going to pursue. So that's one. The third one I wanted to mention was the sustainability and energy management. That one was one that UCF took the lead on, and it was intended initially to, we feel like we've been doing a lot of interesting and creative things here. We want to share those with some of the other schools. Well, I think David Norvell, he's our energy guru, he's back in the back here. But what we found was that everybody's doing something a little bit different, but everybody is already doing things. They're moving ahead and trying to conserve energy where they can, and there's a lot of creative ideas. So we've got a little moving group going from school to school. I think they're coming here in the next month to look at some of the things that we're doing. So we're sharing back best practices, just to give you a sense of what's involved in some of those things. I'll start with some of the low-hanging fruit that we're probably all involved in, but I'll just give you some examples of what UCF is doing that I think some of you around the table say, yeah, we're doing that too, and we want to push it. We've initiated programs now that are saving us $248,000 a year just through the installation of thousands of high-efficiency fluorescent lights and motion sensors, and that's an ongoing savings. We put in thermal solar energy systems on the top of one of our residence towers that will save us about $45,000 annually on heating hot water. There's a couple of student competitions, for an example. We've saved up to about $56,000 today holding student competitions among the dormitories, the residence halls, to see who could save the most energy. And what we found is interesting about that is once the competition is over, the practices that students adopted to win the competition are holding on. They're continuing to do the things that allow them to compete well in those contests. So that's really been helpful. Another one that's two more that are a little bit different that I want to talk about is one of them is that we've created commissioning teams on campus to go into, we listed the buildings in order of energy inefficiency, so to speak, and we're attacking those not necessarily in order because there are limits to what you can do in individual buildings. But to make a longer story short, we're going to some of the more inefficient buildings, taking this team of people in, and they're recommissioning, or in some cases, some of the older buildings, commissioning for the first time those buildings and seeing some dramatic savings in energy costs. David will probably laugh at me trying to be an energy engineer here and explain this one to you, but just for an example, most of our buildings have electronic controls that control the air temperature in a room. And typically in Florida, the first thing that happens is you have to chill the air down really low to wring the humidity and moisture out. Then you have to heat the air back up to have it at a comfortable temperature as you pump it in the room. So you look for the optimum relationship between chilling and heating to get to the right temperature. In fact, the room can be very comfortable, but you could have chilled it way more than you needed to get the moisture out, and then have to use an enormous amount of energy to heat it back up to get it to a comfortable temperature. So there's a lot you can do with the controls. And then there's the fans and I don't know, it just gets really interesting, all the different things you can do in taking care of the heating and cooling, the water supplies and so forth, and buildings. And it's not necessarily the older buildings, it can be newer ones as well that you can achieve these savings. So we're seeing about $500,000 a year in ongoing savings resulting from the program so far, and we expect to see more savings as we move forward. Since about 2005 or 6, we've reduced our energy consumption per square foot by electrical energy consumption per square foot by 22%. So that's pretty good, I think, at a time of rising energy costs. And a lot of the savings we're putting in place, the programs we're putting in place, are going to serve as well as the prices continue to go up. The last one I want to mention in that regard is something that's a little bit unusual. I know OUC is doing this, as it's done in several other places, but we're building on one side of the campus a 3 million gallon storage tank that we, at night, will chill 3 million gallons of water when the rates are about half of what they are during the peak and then hold that water until the middle of the day, roughly, when the energy costs are up, and then we'll draw down on that chilled water to supplement the chilled water generation that we serve all the buildings with for our cooling systems. So we're looking at roughly a $700,000 a year savings that will come to us or through to us, actually a cost avoidance. $700,000 a year in cost avoidance from that system that we're putting in. So there's a lot of things that you can do and that we are doing that can really help us in these times of rising energy costs. So those are the three initiatives that we're working on right now out of that list, and we're going to be continuing to do good things, I hope. And jumping back just for 1 second to the insurance, for example, there, now that we feel we've been pretty successful on the builder's risk, we want to go back and start to look at other forms of insurance to see if there's some master programs that would incorporate even broader ranges of insurance products into some master programs that all the universities could avail themselves of. So again, in a nutshell, what we're trying to do is achieve some economies of scale through communications.
Thank you, Bill. Governor Duncan, do you have anything to add?
But just one thing that I just want to make sure as you guys, because I do think it was great that you broke into your groups and are really moving the ball forward, because what we didn't want to do is talk or study any of this to death. We wanted to get something going. But I just, especially as now some of them are getting there, I just want to make sure that the other institutions do at least know about it. So if they have an interest, you know, even if it's pre-formal rollout, that they are allowed to kind of join in if they've got one where they're about to go do something rather than them doing it and then being out of cycle because they just missed it.
That's a good point, and I agree with you. That's where we'll use the capital group. All the vice presidents from administration and finance will share all of the work that we've done today. And then now that we've got some rollout dates and things that we're looking for, we'll share all of those. So I think we're out at that point where we should start to share those things. The first item will be sharing the builder's risk program that we're doing.
And then I guess my one other thing, just to make sure, this is probably more of a Tim thing, but just how we are tracking and capturing the success of these programs and that we got our baselines and methodology set up for that.
We do work with Tim. He is involved in some of our meetings to keep track of what we're doing, and we can easily and would like to work through him and report back what's going on.
Okay.
Any other questions for Vice President Mark? Yeah, Governor Edwards.
Not necessarily a question, but following up on Ann's comment. My first assignment on this board was chair a committee that dealt with best practices. I was amazed that we projected the first year, which would have been 2 years ago, the system would have saved over $100 million. Where we are now, I don't know. I don't think that we are getting proper credit for what we're doing in these areas. Whenever I speak to my local delegation, they always talk about fat in the system. I mean, I've heard that for 35 years now. We have done a tremendous job in this area, and we're going to do better, but we don't pat ourselves on the back for it. I really think that it's extremely important that we have a system to follow up and to record the savings that we are making. And we just, you know, whenever we do good, we need to brag about it. And we have certainly done a tremendous job here, and nobody knows it.
I think that's a point very well taken, Governor Edwards and Vice President Mark. Thanks for a great report. Can we get perhaps a written version that we could then maybe bullet point down so we can use as talking points? I think a lot of the topics that you raised were very informative and best practices that I think system-wide will save a substantial amount of money.
Mr. Chair,
Madam Chair.
can I ask a question? I guess of Governor Duncan, because she is the person on that task force. Are you looking at it? I mean, I know that we kind of had the task limited to best practices, but there are some things, because as he talks about builder's risk, it reminds me of things that I know a lot about, because I've done a lot of huge construction. But there are things like wraps and that sort of thing that could benefit not just a project, but a statewide approach? Are we looking at things like that?
I mean, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Can I respond to that?
Go ahead.
We are, and we will. We talked about that, we had a number of discussions about some of the reps that you're talking about. We were far enough along with the builder's risk program that we wanted to complete that one so we could have a success that we could nail on the wall. And now we're looking at the broader range of insurance products and services to see if there's something much larger that we can get into that will help us all. So we are looking at that.
Good, because you can actually save money or get money back through some of those programs.
Correct.
President Kenshaft?
I want to commend this project as well. I think it's really phenomenal. The comment about how all of us have different expiration dates for some of our long-term contracts is really essential, because we're all trying to save money within our own areas. But if we can get, as you had mentioned, the expiration dates to fall in line at a certain point, then boy, are we powerful. So I think that's really, really good.
Governor Duncan?
And I guess just, I mean, again, we've been trying to balance the limited staff resources and trying to keep the ball moving, but I guess my one request, and I haven't talked with Rick Walsh, my co-chair, on this one, but I really, my sense is, and I think maybe what you're hearing from these comments is getting CAFA together to at least make sure everyone's on the same page of where we're heading on some of the big ones needs to not wait for the perfect rollout. We probably need to do that and keep that conversation going, at least at that level, and then we can roll out the rollout schedule as we're ready.
Any further comments? Seeing none, thank you, Vice President Merck, and thank you, Governor Duncan and Trustee Chair Walsh, for this project. It is important, and I think we're seeing some results and constant updating to the board. I think Governor Edwards is right. We need to talk a little bit more about where we are there. Let's move on to agenda item 7. This agenda item is up because, frankly, we're looking at our budgetary future, and we have some challenges on the horizon. Most of you are familiar with the monetization concept. You know, the state of Florida has actually considered monetizing some of their own larger assets, including the Florida Turnpike, possibly. However, the Board of Governors has never really looked into this as a way to at least provide a tool or a weapon in the quiver of our universities. Jay Redd and the Gates Capital Group came and made a presentation to me and said, here's a tool that your universities may want to consider. And frankly, after looking at it, I thought, you know what, it might be a tool that our universities may want to consider. So they have come in from Cleveland in order to make a brief presentation to us to kind of help highlight the difference between monetization of assets and traditional financing methods through bond finance, that sort of thing. I do want to be clear, they're using hypothetical examples in this presentation with assumptions. Our Board of Governors debt guidelines don't specifically address monetization yet. So if any of the universities have an interest in pursuing this type of a financing approach, we may need to make a few tweaks and changes, particularly with debt service levels. We're not certain yet. But I did want to spend about 5 or 10 minutes in a brief presentation just to introduce you to the concept and let you know it was out there, because frankly, when it was presented to me, I found it fascinating. So let me introduce Jay Redd out of Gates Capital Group, who's here just to educate us a little bit. Good morning, Jay.
Good morning. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good morning to the rest of the board. My name is Jay Redd from Gates Capital Resources. Joined by my colleague, Graham White, here this morning. Just briefly, I know we're short on time. Our firm specializes in monetizing apartment assets as a vehicle to deliver alternative sources of capital. As we've been listening to some of the presentations this morning, understanding the economic climate in Florida. As Mr. Chair said, we approached him and we had some conversations. We thought it would be a prudent time to present our structure to you as you think about your capital needs, your working capital needs going forward. With that, what we've done in our materials this morning, we've taken a typical traditional bond financing transaction in the state of Florida here, and we thought that was probably the best vehicle to compare and contrast our product versus a traditional bond deal. So on page 2 here, for lack of a better name, ABC University may issue parking revenue bonds for $30 million for a parking garage. This particular asset will be built on a surface lot.
So to be clear, we're in section 2 of the presentation book?
Yes, page 2, I'm sorry.
Page 8.
Oh, sorry.
page 9, yeah.
This particular asset, once completed, will deliver significant additional spaces. Preliminary sources and uses from a bond proceed perspective, roughly $25 million. Another $1.8 million in debt service reserve funds and $0.9 million in cost of issuance. And most importantly, for this particular transaction, the university would be required to make an equity contribution of $7.3 million. So to compare and contrast our product to that structure, essentially what we propose via the monetization is a straightforward lease-back transaction. We are not buying the asset, we are simply leasing the asset from the institution. Simultaneous to that, we would lease the asset back to the institution, but we would prepay our lease upfront in the form of an upfront payment to the institution at closing, and then the institution would lease the asset back and make payments to us over time. And that benefit of that is you're simply extracting the economic value of the parking assets. What I tell clients all the time is that in these tough economic times, this is a vehicle that allows you to manage your balance sheet and pull out economic value of assets that are currently on your balance sheet. And most institutions, universities, in some capacity have executed a lease-back transaction at some point. So that's essentially our product. We would size and look at the transaction very similarly to a bond transaction. On this next page, this slide, we have the pro forma for this university's parking system. This would be the starting point for the bond transaction to see what kind of revenue is being thrown off from the system after your operating expenses, to size the bond yield against the available revenues. In our model, we would also take a look at the performance of that asset once it's completed, to throw those additional revenues into the pot, if you will, with respect to sizing the transaction. And again, it's a straightforward pro forma. We've made some assumptions with respect to adding on the new asset and extending the pro forma, if you will, to reflect that, thereby increasing the revenues available for monetization. On the next page, this page kind of ties it all together for us. What we have here is simply what the home run page, we call it, of our product. If you look at the conservative revenue growth, a conservative expense growth, you look at the middle column, the NOI column. Beside that is the lease payment column. That is a fixed payment column. It does not fluctuate. And as you can see, the excess cash flow next to the lease payment column accumulates over time, or a cumulative cash flow column. And under this particular structure, the additional $34 million in proceeds will flow back to the university. It's important to note on this particular slide, what we do is we structure against the revenue stream of the assets. We never take control of the assets. We're not seeking to come in and take over your parking operation. We're simply delivering capital reflective of the future economic value of your parking assets. The institution maintains operational control, rate setting and building, just like you always run your parking systems. And candidly, we have an interest because the systems aren't very well run. The excess cash flow will flow back to the university. We have no financial entitlement to that number. So essentially, we will deliver an upfront payment to you. You will lease that asset back from us and then make lease payments to us. Any financial revenues above the lease payment are the properties of the university, as they always have been. They will continue to flow through. You will continue to assign and disperse those revenues as you always have. So it's important to note we are not seeking to take over the parking operations. We're not seeking to buy the assets. We're simply giving you value for those assets in a tough economic climate. And what we've come to realize from this analysis, we could probably deliver in the neighborhood of $90 million based on the pro forma that we looked at a couple of slides ago. So now let's really compare and contrast the sources and uses from the hypothetical bond deal versus our financing. As you can see, going on the left side of the page, you have your bond proceeds, your OID, take that into consideration. And then there's the equity contribution. So to effectuate this particular transaction, the university was required to put up $7.2 million. In today's times, that's a big equity contribution for a parking asset. What we're saying is we can take the existing cash flows of those other assets, finance more than the bond transaction, allow the university to keep the $7 million in its coffers to be used as it sees fit, and let the parking assets fund that and other projects that may be on the horizon that are being discussed. So again, as we go through the uses of funds on the bottom, you can see what the uses are from the bond transaction. At the very bottom is an important box, I should say, with respect to the true interest costs. And note that that box does not reflect the opportunity cost associated with your equity contribution. It does not take that into account. You have certain investment rules and guidelines, so your opportunity cost for putting that into the transaction probably will vary institution by institution. Conversely, on our transaction, we deliver the proceeds, the uses of funds. We can certainly build the proposed garage without any problem. Additionally, we have excess monies, and what can those monies be used for? Other projects, med schools, dormitories, student housing, student centers, things like that. Now, I will say that our cost of funds is higher than the bond proceed cost of funds because there are private monies, taxable monies from the private sector. And what we preach to that is flexibility, flexibility, flexibility. The bond proceeds, as you all know, are governed by indenture, IRS tax law. We don't have that issue. We give you unrestricted, flexible proceeds. Therein lies the increased cost of funds to you. On the next slide, when you a new transaction, the initial reaction is, well, can this be done in the state of Florida? We've spoken with a couple of bond firms. We've gone to look at the statutes on the top bullet there with respect to the bylaws of the Board of Governors. We feel very comfortable with that. As we go down this page, listen, at the end of the day, you have a relationship with your bond counsel. They certainly would weigh in and give you their opinion with respect to the flexibility you have in a transaction like this. We think the framework does exist to effectuate these transactions. It's simply a leaseback transaction, not a sale leaseback. I know we've had some conversations with Chris Kinsley. He referenced section 1062. We did some research on that as well, Chris. We came to the conclusion that depending on how you term the proceeds of working capital versus capital improvements, it wouldn't be an issue, but certainly to work through that issue with the respective institution to allow you to realize the proceeds from the transaction. And again, I think the last page here, most importantly, we are delivering maximum proceeds from your parking assets. We spent some time back in fall with Bill Murphy here at UCF. Just fascinated by the extent of his parking system here. Most of the institutions in the system have vast parking assets. And from our perspective, there's a lot of money on your balance sheet that can potentially be tapped. The hypothetical case we just went through, we could deliver an additional $66 million above and beyond the bond proceeds amount. Most importantly, the second bullet, there's no equity contribution required. That $7.3 million stays in your coffers. As you probably have realized intuitively, you're also not paying for a debt service reserve fund, bond insurance, and cost of issuance over 25 years. And again, the proceeds from our transaction can be dispersed as you see fit on other parking assets, dormitories, student centers, medical schools, whatever the need may be. Preserve your future bonding capacity. And most importantly, you maintain control of your assets. We cannot say that enough time that we're not seeking to come in, take over your assets, and do rates and charges. You continue to run your operation as you always have. It's simply a balance sheet management opportunity to realize the economic value in those assets. And in tough times like this, we think it's an attractive opportunity.
Great. Thank you, Jay. Are there any questions for Jay Red on his presentation?
I do have one.
Yeah.
Out of curiosity, on page 12, where you have the 3.89 revenue growth, what part of that is volume driven and what part of that is pricing?
Well, what we did, we looked at the pro forma hypothetically and looked at the average growth in revenue of the preceding 5 years and just held that constant as an assumption. When we get into a live transaction, we work with the institution, look at your history of rates and charges, and we also understand that in higher education, a lot of this has to be a process. The students are involved, you have meetings and so forth. So we would look to the institution to give us a sharpened pencil, if you will, rate revenue growth number.
Yeah, so that's historic.
Yes, that's just
it's not a forecast. You just took this. Your forecast is based on a historic. Okay,
yes,
thank you.
It is.
Other questions? Yeah, I just want to be
clear in your presentation, when your institution comes in and executes the lease and the lease back, complete and total control over the parking assets, the management, the price setting, and everything else still remains within the university.
Absolutely. Transferring a mortgage, it's not a sale leaseback, it's only a leaseback. We simply evaluate the cash flow of the asset, extrapolate it out, present value it back into limited capital. You maintain operational control, rates and charges, your union issues, your labor issues. We are not involved in that. And also, equally as important, our financial interest is capped at a lease payment. We're not entitled to anything above it. And it's a fixed payment just like a bond. That payment does not fluctuate.
And there are no restrictions, visa, bond covenants, no reserves, nothing to be maintained in order to...
No, it's a single document transaction. It's simply a lease. We have a master lease document with it. It's a very straightforward transaction.
Thank you. Other questions or comments for Mr. Red?
One question.
Go ahead.
Assume the worst economy, much worse than it is now, and revenues are half what you projected. What happens?
Well, our ultimate source of security, let's say 5 to 10 years down the line, you can no longer make the lease payments. We would look to the university and say, well, can you make up the difference out of your general fund or what have you? If that's not an option, the very last resort is we would then come in and operate those assets only to recoup our financial interest, and then we walk away from it. At no point are we seeking to buy those assets from the institution. We would simply look to the assets initially, then in the second level, we would look to the general fund of the institution, and then ultimately we would operate the assets if we still cannot be made whole, only to recoup our financial interest, and only for the term of the lease. It's not as if the default occurs and now it's ours. That's not the case either.
Governor Martin.
What's the average term of the lease?
We have flexibility with that. We can go 20, 25, or we can go 15 years. We have tremendous flexibility in our product. We can tailor a product to fit an individual institution. We can start at 15 years and go to 35 years. Whatever works best for your balance sheet and your cash flow with your projections and so forth. So we have a lot of flexibility.
Other questions for Mr. Red? Governor Tripp.
I didn't get to see much of that, but in terms of maintenance, rebuilding, things of that nature, how is that covered?
Well, what we would do within the lease document, we would have specified that the university would continue to handle those capital improvements maintenance as it always has. So we continue to make those commissions.
Thank you.
Other questions or comments? Seeing none, thank you, Mr. Red. I presume your contact information is in the...
Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. And Mr. White, thank you for coming down as well. We didn't hear from you. We are past our time to adjourn. I did want to go back to, very briefly, Madam Chair, and touch on the tuition differential conversation that we had during our phone conference last week, particularly those areas with regard to measuring and metrics of the success and how we define success of the use of the tuition differential funds, and how we will monitor, track, and account for the 30% of the differential tuition, which is required to be given to need-based financial aid or replaced by new private sources to equal 30% of that tuition differential. I spent a couple of hours in the working group meeting yesterday, and if nothing else, it led me to understand that there is some confusion and some opportunity for more confusion in these processes. So I will ask this committee to pay close attention with me over the next couple of months as we move through this process. I'm asking staff to bring a recommendation to our August committee meeting where we can take a look at how we are going to treat, account for, measure, and monitor the 30% differential tuition financial aid component, as well as the metrics. And if not comfortable with what the working group or the team comes up with,
Chair McDivitt, I'm probably going to ask for a special task force of the board. We've got to report to the legislature by January. We don't have a lot of time, but this issue can tend to be complicated if people choose to make it so. And based upon yesterday, it seemed to me that people are going to choose to make it so. So we may need to engage a little more actively as a board, and I'll ask this committee's indulgence to join me in that after August if we're not comfortable with where we are.
Could I just make a very short comment? I did some research after I got the legislation. It took me a long time. On page 510, it says, "This expenditure for need-based financial aid shall not supplant the amount of need-based aid provided to undergraduate students in the preceding fiscal year." So I did a lot of research. I looked up the word supplant. It says, it's very simple, replace, to replace by something else. So, as long as they're not changing that simple meaning, I don't think we have a problem. But if they start talking about what the legislature did previously, how they've cut this and that, then I think we're getting away from what really happened.
We may need to stay the course on that government trip. So,
Thank you.
Jury's out until the August meeting. However, I would ask your indulgence as a committee. In August, if we need to, we may need to dive into that process. I have no other business on the agenda. Does anyone have any other items to discuss? Seeing none, we stand adjourned.